Your grandparents didn't just cook. They mastered dishes that we've somehow forgotten, and it's time to bring them back. From lost comfort foods to shockingly simple meals that taste better than anything store-bought, these recipes definitely deserve a comeback. Hush puppy soup is something that combines an old classic which basically amounts to cornmeal tater tots today, but was a really beloved recipe back then. As you may have already guessed, the name of this one is hush puppies, and they were really just cornmeal fried dough balls. This recipe had you incorporating them into a broth, which was definitely one way to take things. The idea was to make this thick and savory corn soup that would have worked on any day of the week. Now, recipes like this really popped up in the 1930s when everything had gone down the gutter, but this was one that people kept bringing back because of how homely and rustic it was. The corn was really straightforward. There was no subtext. What you saw is what you got. You'd smell this in your grandparents' kitchen, and every moment spent inhaling the fragrance was a build-up to a taste that's exactly what you imagined: nutty and buttery, rich corn. The savory-sweet balance was definitely something people loved about this more than anything, except maybe how hearty it was. One of these could really fill you up. You ever wonder what a farmer goes to drink after a long day? Definitely not a can of Bud Light, maybe Corona. What they actually drank was a Switchel Pie, and that might be the first time you've heard of anyone really drinking pies. Truth is, Switchel used to be this 19th century peasant drink that was really popular among farmers. It was as bare bones as you could, and anything less would be challenging the definition of a drink, but this was basically the closest thing to all-natural Gatorade. It was made with water, vinegar, molasses, honey, and ginger. Now, the Gatorade bit comes from the fact that it hydrates you better than one of those bottles with a cheesy quote for every hour ever could. Plus, the molasses and the ginger actually end up making a pretty good tasting drink, all things considered. Now, there was the drink form of this, and there was the custard form of this. That version was more like a chess pie, and it was pretty much known for always having a butter crust. Sound like your thing? Maybe you'd have fit better in the 19th century. Or maybe this is one recipe you should try out in your kitchen this weekend. Pennsylvania Dutch Schnitz and Knepp either sounds like a cartoonishly villainous rich megacorporation or a sitcom title. But it's actually this classic Pennsylvania Dutch dish that takes dried apples along with ham and dumplings. See, the apples are the scents, while the latter two are the Knepp. The logic behind that is as lost on me as it is on you, dear viewer. But one thing that didn't go over anybody's heads was just how good this tasted. Now, usually bone broths have this weird taste to them that puts a lot of people off, but this was just a really nice, smoky broth that had bits of country ham, smoked ham hock, and marrow. It was thick, velvety rich, and it had the perfect texture. On top of that, the dish had so much flavor thanks to the way the Dutch community then cured and salted their own meats. I mean, if you made this now, I don't think it'd taste anything as pure or rich as that, but this is definitely one worth bringing back. Water pie is a recipe that came right out of the heart of the Depression era and was a monument to how sweet desserts are one of the most important aspects of a civilized society. They were something that came out of necessity and scarcity, since nobody really had the means to make anything even resembling an actual dessert, baked or otherwise, back then. In the South and Midwest, ingredients like eggs and milk had dried up completely. So how did your grandparents manage? Well, this pie was something that shook a lot of people because it was possible with just 5 things: water, sugar, flour, butter, and vanilla, which I'll admit were in dangerously low supply all around. But when people had just enough to spare that it wouldn't hurt, they'd make this. Despite having butter, sugar, and vanilla, it's not as sweet as you might think. The sweetness is pretty gentle. It's not really in your face. Most people wouldn't bother with the vanilla because it was just expensive and unnecessary. But if they did, it made the pie go up a notch or two. The vanilla aroma really makes this stand out. And if you recreate this, you should definitely be a lot more liberal with the ingredients. Bavarian-style fried dough, or otherwise known as knee pastries and Knieküchle, is as close as Germans are ever getting to proper donuts, I think. I'm just kidding. It was something that was introduced way back when German immigrants had first started pouring into America. including a lot of the people that would come to make up the Pennsylvania Dutch. Now there's some history with your food. The name for it actually comes from a method of stretching dough that's traditional for German cooks, but was foreign to American kitchens. They would stretch the dough over the knee of the baker before they fried it, and while you might think this does absolutely nothing, and while initially I may have been inclined to agree with you, this actually does do a lot. It makes this very puffy center that has wonderfully crispy edges that really help support the dish. A crispy and pillowy texture helps because the warmth and richness of it feels all the more better thanks to that. The first bite usually breaks those edges apart, and that gives way to the beautiful center, so this dish is a delight for your senses as much as it is for your taste buds. What your grandparents probably did if they were into baking or lived around areas where the Pennsylvania Dutch were present was coat it with jam, which would really help give it a lot more depth and just make the dish more refreshing overall. Shrimp wiggy is a really obscure dish. It's actually a little bit mysterious if you think about it too. It's a dish that has some pretty limited historical recording of it, so I had to dig into deep waters to get this information for you. But really, Tit, it's basically just a shrimp casserole and stew hybrid. Usually people would thicken it with breadcrumbs, crackers, or a really light type of roux. The briny and sweet flavor of the shrimp was really good, especially when the shrimp was fresh or canned. It had a refreshing taste that reminded you of the seaside, and the breadcrumbs gave it a wonderful crunch. Now, most people really try to experiment with different kinds of spices. You had some who would swear by odd amounts of black pepper. Others died on the paprika hill and have been buried there since. Further still, you'll find Worcestershire truthers as far as the eye can see, but the real question is, how do you like your shrimp? This is a dish that really just relies on the natural flavors of its ingredients, so if you're looking for low-effort seafood for yourself, this is a good place to stop. Salmagundi is this really old English-American dish that basically predates even modern salads. It was originally made as this multi-layered petri dish of different kinds of meats, seafood, and eggs along with pickled vegetables, but it really started to take off as a dish that the wealthy would enjoy. Now, if some of you come from money, maybe you've ever heard of this being passed down in the family cookbooks. The other audience Salmagundi found a loving and comfortable home for itself in were ship crews, and the many different kinds of varieties of this they would make. Salmagundi's taste was something that was never ever set in stone. Basically, it's a lot like a hot pot, where gathering the ingredients for the dish, assembling it all, and preparing it is just as vital to the experience as eating it is. And just like hot pot, depending on what you pick for your Salmagundi, you could end up with anything from a herbaceous stew with nothing but parsley and tarragon taking over your mouth to a soft and creamy, slightly eggy oceanic stew. It was really a lot of things, but one thing Salmagundi never was: boring. This was a dish that had the potential to entertain you for years and years. Coca-Cola Chicken might just sound like the dumbest and most out-of-pocket thing as far as food recommendations go, but this is my hear me out. Coca-Cola Chicken started off as being this attempt at making quirky fusion food that had a nice little sweet and savory twist to it. You know, something for both worlds. It was something that started to gain an incredible amount of upward momentum in the American South, especially in Chinese-American home cooking, as they were already fans of sticky chicken in their rice-based dishes. The dish also involved a lot of simmering chicken, which was usually some that was also common in Chinese cuisine. The basic mix was just Coca-Cola, soy sauce, ketchup, and then some barbecue sauce all put together in a neat little pan until it made the most decadent and fizzy glaze you had ever seen. The Coca-Cola is supposed to reduce down, but while it does that, it creates a sweetness that's almost reminiscent of molasses. It's not really quite the same, but it has a lot of hints of vanilla and spice coming in. Despite what you might expect, this dish actually has a decent amount of umami to it as well, and a tang that makes you want to come back for more and more. Mock turtle soup is a soup that first made its way to American shores all the way from 18th century England, and while some people initially thought it should have stayed there, enough people warmed up to it. Well, at least enough for us to be able to say this was a common recipe among our grandparents. Now, turtle was never really something that was going to be popular with the American people right from the get-go, but it was in the deepest pits of the Depression that people found the room in their heart to put aside their mortal differences and finally focus on the real problem: hunger. Not borrowing from our European rivals. No, hunger. And this was a dish that did a phenomenal job of keeping that at bay. It had an incredibly deep and beefy richness to it because the base of the turtle soup was just a lot of broth, right? Broth that had been stewing in collagen for quite a while, absorbing all the flavors from the meat. It was a deeply comforting experience according to some old recipes and references, but I'm still not sure about trying it today. Red flannel hash is a really rustic dish that comes from some of the best and most familiar ingredients known to Americans. You have yourself all the typical classics here, man. We got corned beef, potatoes, and beets, so take your pick. It's definitely giving Southern this time around. Now, this dish has a lot of savory notes going on because the hash is packed with umami, while the briny depth from the corned beef really contrasts it and makes a complex flavor profile. The cured and intense beefy flavor is something that only gets accentuated by the use of mustard seed and peppercorn. Sorry, did this turn into a food analysis channel? This was basically just old-school comfort food, and it was the type of thing your grandparents would come back to or make for each other with a lot of life. The first bite is perfect for savory lovers, but it keeps having something for everyone as you go along. Frog pie is a really obscure dish that has a few regional variations to it. It was a dish you would most commonly find in rural American cookbooks, family notes passed down here and there, and other collections of recipes that managed to stay safe. Despite the name, though, and I know this might be a real kicker, the dish didn't actually involve any frogs. Well, at least not all the time. Sometimes people just made it with poultry or whatever kind of fish was laying around. Other people would swear by frog legs, especially in the Ozarks or Louisiana where a lot of frogs were abundant. Mild, sweet, and tender, frog meat was a different world unto its own for the average American Joe back then. Ask your grandpa if he's ever eaten frog legs during his time, because you might be surprised with the answer. Now, the pie actually had this really thick, creamy gravy as the base of it. It was really just made from broth or butter and milk, plus some flour, but it was a lot like how a chicken pot pie is. Then you had some shallots, thyme, parsley, and garlic for some aroma, and the rest just came from the frogs. Farm-raised frogs were a lot different from ones that had been caught in the wild, by the way. Pepper pot soup is a really nice soup. It has such strong ties to Philadelphia and the Caribbean cuisine that was once really popular there in the 20th century, and to be honest, still is. This was a recipe that was actually a favorite of the people during the Revolutionary War, and the reason for that was a little interesting bit of trivia. See, George Washington's troops, when they were stationed at Valley Forge, would famously eat a lot of pepper pot soup to the point where it became something of a local rumor. Now, the dish on its own has very little American roots, if any. It's a West African and Caribbean dish through and through. If I had to describe the experience of it in one way, it would be like constantly drinking liquid chili flakes, or like just drinking a much better version of instant ramen noodle broth. The thing is, each person's recipe was really unique to them. Overall, though, it was basically just a really complex dish that has a very distinctly peppery bite to it. It's never overwhelming, but it does linger in your mouth a lot. It's good that it's backed up by so many herbal spices to help keep that at bay, though, because otherwise I think it would get pretty old pretty fast. Yankee's dripped cornbread was a northern-style cornbread that was known for how light and fluffy it was. This unique way of dripping milk or cream wasn't something people had always done, but when they got to it, they couldn't get enough of it. See, the idea was to drip milk into the batter. This is what actually helped to set it apart so strongly from typical Southern cornbread, which, believe it or not, is extremely dense. I mean, seriously, just a loaf of that thing could have you out of commission until dinner. Yankee-style cornbread is just a lot sweeter and softer, and the fact that it's typically always served with the most delicious syrup or butter doesn't help matters at all for its competitors. A soft and pillowy cornbread with little pockets of custard-like bites sounds like everyone's idea of a good time, and it honestly was. This was a dish that grandparents would abuse as much as they could because of how much the kids loved it, which is also why it got so popular. It's one of the most classic examples of less being more. Potato candy might sound like one of the most genuinely confusing things ever to you, but it's as real as it gets. Potato candy is a very nostalgic confection that originated somewhere in the Appalachia a very long time ago, but it got picked up by the Pennsylvania Dutch communities in the early parts of the 20th century. It was a Depression-era recipe that was just made with mashed potatoes instead of any other kinds of expensive ingredients. You had your nuts and butter, but that was it. Most of the famous versions of this dish just consist of sugary and soft potato-based dough that's been soaked in peanut butter. What does stand out about this dish is the unique pinwheel shape that it has, though. It works out surprisingly well for this dish because the potato itself actually doesn't have a lot of flavor once it gets mixed in with the powdered sugar. It has a starchy undertone, but that's mostly it. Your first most prominent tastes are going to be a strong splash of vanilla and a warm bakery-like fragrance created by the peanut butter, sugary dough, and the extract. It's about as hard as you would expect a potato candy to be, but it's also way better than you would give it credit. I don't know, I think I might make this one a regular in my kitchen. What about you? Turnip greens gravy is one of the most southern dishes you can ever have, specifically because it decides to double down on the savoriness as much as it possibly can. This is a dish that's also utilizing the liquor that forms at the bottom of the pot from the slow-cooked turnip greens. It forms the base for a really rich gravy, and it's one of the best things you can have if you're looking to branch out into Southern soul food and see what side of America has to offer. Most people would often just pour it over biscuits, grits, rice, and different kinds of cornbread, whereas others would basically just have all of that as an accompaniment to the dish. They would instead choose to prioritize things like the ham hocks, the smoked turkey, the bacon drippings, and the other super savory aspects of the dish. Despite all that, the other ingredients like the apple cider vinegar and sauces also added this acidic tang to it that really stuck around in the minds of a lot of people. It was one of those kinds of dishes where it was good going down as it was biting into it, you know? The aromatics would work, the texture was amazing, it all came together brilliantly. Nothing was amiss here. Salt rising bread is a pretty unique kind of bread. It's actually something that dates back all the way to the 17th and 18th centuries, and it was originally said to have come from the Appalachian region. So the name of this recipe might make you think that the salt here is what makes the bread, rise. It is not actually used as a leavening agent, but it refers to a technique that was popular back then. People used to leave bread on beds of heated salt so that they would be kept warm. Now, I'm not sure this was in our grandparents' time period. They're old, but not that old. Back to the bread, though. This is a really cheesy bread with an unusually dense crumb. It has a texture that's very unique to it, which I can only describe as a very vintage bread that's been kept warm just perpetually. It used to be a real hit back in the day, but maybe this is one you guys would debate bringing this back? Carrot marmalade could never quite rise to the heights of carrot cake or cobbler, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a very valid place in history and this list. So carrot marmalade used to be something that originated and came to us from Britain, but it actually got really popular in North America. Plus, this is still a recipe set in our grandparents' time. Especially if your grandparents were from the early parts of the 21st century, when wartime rationing had become the norm for everyone's daily routine. In those times, citrus fruits had become really scarce because most people had just plucked the markets and harvests dry. The popular alternative started to be carrots for how naturally sweet they were. Plus, they had a lot of pectin, which is something people used in this marmalade. The idea is to cook the carrots with a mix of zest and sugar until it hits this almost jam-like consistency. It's almost just kind of like a tart spread, really, but with all the magic of carrots. Plus, did you know people used to use marmalade for cake fillings? It's pretty much the precursor to carrot cakes. If you ever wanted to point at a dish and use it to showcase the sheer innovativeness of American cooks in hard times, you'd have to at least consider cabbage pudding. That is, if you don't pick it entirely. This is a recipe that is so far back from the past that it predates our way of life entirely. I mean, the entire reason cabbages were so trendy back then was because of how easy they were to preserve and how long they would last. In a world with no mass refrigeration, that's a pretty damn good deal. Not only did it last an incredibly long while, this was a real all-rounder too. Cabbage pudding could be served sweet or savory, whichever one you're more comfortable with. So the savory version basically is just shredded or diced cabbage being mixed with ingredients like bacon and eggs or breadcrumbs, sometimes all three. Then you would bake this until it would achieve this really custard-like consistency that was irresistible. The sweet version followed the same process, but you would switch out the savory ingredients for sweet ones like sugar and warm spices. Another difference is that it really worked well as a soft pudding instead of a custard. It also worked great as a pie. See how versatile this is? Now, you might have never heard of something called grape catsup. How could you? After all, it's been totally forgotten now, but uncovering lost history and food at the same time is what we are here to do. So today, I'm going to start by bursting your ketchup bubble. Did you know that people used to make fruit-based ketchups besides just tomatoes? Stuff like grapes, which would usually be Concord or some other top-tier variety, were very popular back in the day. People even used to make the condiment out of mushrooms, whether or not you can believe it. It was actually about as popular as regular tomato ketchup is nowadays. People used to take mushrooms, salt and spices and vinegar and throw all that in to make a lovely little mushroom ketchup. So grapes, in comparison, can't be too out of pocket, right? Besides, it went with a lot of things, and it did a pretty good job of being a sidekick. The most common pairings for grape catsup would usually be roasted poultry and roasted duck, and that was because a lot of people thought that they were great as a condiment for those dishes. Plus, catsup is a little different because it's distinctly more aromatic than it is overwhelming, so it's always a joy to have around. Nowadays, it has seen a slightly small revival, but nothing big enough to really say it's back, you know? Beaver tail soup has history in several different areas that go back several different long roads. From indigenous peoples to French trappers and European poachers, fur traders, it seemed like everybody wanted a piece of the beaver pie, if not the whole thing outright. Beaver tails are a prized possession in indigenous culture and have been a long-respected part of that culture for as far back as anyone can remember. Now, of course, there's something in it for them too. Beaver tail fat happens to be extremely rich in fat, and a lot of tribes relied on it as one of their most important and accessible sources of energy. Despite what you might think or not think about the little rodent, their tails were also valued for their fur, and beavers fetched quite a decent price on the market. I mean, catching one of these meant you were going to have a good week, but if you caught yourself a few, or an entire bundle, then you were looking at a petty lucrative sum. It's a bit sad to say, but that's really just how it went down. Despite that, beaver tail soup wasn't a source of constant discontent about how they're poaching all the beavers. It was also one of people's biggest comforts. Now, one of the most common uses of beaver tails was the soup you would make out of it. This was an emergency ration, supper, relief in the winter, a medicinal broth, and comfort food all in one. It was a very versatile recipe that had more uses than the next 10 things we can cook up, which is exactly why I think it's worth bringing back. Corncob jelly is another really popular one that your grandparents used to make a lot, but just never bothered telling you about. You ever wonder what people did with all those cobs after they had plucked every last kernel of corn from them? Well, some people would throw them away, others would just play around with it, but some real smart ones would boil the thing and make corncob jelly out of it. Yup, turns out that corn cobs contain a lot of the same stuff that's used in grape catsup, which would be pectin. When it gets boiled, this does get released, and in the end, we all get to experience some very corny and gelatinous fun. It was also a way for people to ensure that absolutely nothing at all ever went to waste, as even using the cob of the corn was seen as a sign of respecting the food you were working with. Now, people basically just had this like a jam or a spread, but that doesn't mean it's something you should take lightly. This corn cob jelly packs a serious punch. Snow pancakes are a really old farmhouse recipe that pretty much uses fresh snow that's got maybe 2 or 3 minutes tops on it as the key ingredient of the pancake. This version has natural ammonia and air bubbles, which, believe it or not, serve as their own organic automated leavening agent. Kind of cool, right? It's also pretty much what makes the pancakes that light and fluffy to begin with. The recipe for these pancakes is something that would vary from user to user, with some people mixing fresh snow with tear flour and eggs, while others would really go overboard on the baking powder. Snow packages were something that dominated throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries in lords of regions with heavy winter snowfall. New England and the upper Midwest would always get the shortest end of the stick as far as it came to just not having a healthy amount of snow, but this was at least a small little way to turn all that frost around you into something slightly decent. P+, these were really quick. The snow would make the pancake cook even faster. Boiled make cake is a really simple rich butter cake that incorporates exactly what the name says. The idea here is to chuck in all that scalded milk into the batter so that the boiling process can take the batter through some transformative phases. The milk's proteins start to change, and the cake gets this really tender crumb that's really heavy once you bite into it, but not too much on the way. Boiled cake is something that's old too, at least it's been around since the 19th century and was a common household name in at least the 20th century. Hey, that makes it older than my grandparents, which is definitely something. It was really on an upward momentum when American farm kitchens, because of how each ingredient was extremely simple, easy to source, and something you probably just had laying around anyway. Now, the cake itself was something that people went absolutely insane for in the 30s and 40s. The home baking trend was on the rise, and a lot of people were actually counting on recipes like these to help them save the costs of cooking. It was usually served plain or UST dusted with some sugar or maybe a glaze on top at the most, but the cake itself had really strong vanilla tastes. Dandelion Jelly. You've probably heard of dandelion salad or something, but jelly? Well, this honey-like spread made from dandelion flowers is about to rock your world and show you the possibilities of this lovely little plant. Dandelions are truly a jack of all trades, and this one might be good enough to qualify for master status. It's got this delicate floral flavor to it, but it has these hints of honey and citrus, meaning that already off the bat, this is a very rare tasting jelly, not the kind you would typically expect at the store or at the bakery. Dandelions were something that had always had a very familiar place in American folk culture and cooking, especially by homesteaders who would live away from urban hubs in cities like New York and San Francisco. Making dandelion jelly was something that was always most commonly observed in the Appalachian regions, where a lot of people started to pass on the knowledge to the surrounding areas. It started to become something of a regional speciality, really. And despite what you may think, it was typically eaten exactly like a fruit preserve. While it's largely very much forgotten now, it does still enjoy a little bit of time in the sun lately as more and more people are remembering retro-style recipes, especially easy and light ones like this. Floating island dessert is this really classic and elegant dessert that you may remember from the time where everybody in the country had a vested national interest in exploring French cuisine and cooking top to bottom. This time, the dessert consisted of this poached meringue, except there would be several of these, right? And I just want you to imagine the kind of poached meringue I'm talking about here. You have to understand that despite how we've used words like light and airy a lot throughout this video, there may really be no better example of those words than the meringue you would experience with this dish. Now, a collection of these meringue islands would end up floating on a pool of creme anglaise, which was really just a fancy way of saying vanilla custard sauce. Excuse my French. The dessert was really melt in your mouth, and it had this beautiful air of elegance to it. It's a dish that I won't say is completely gone from the face of the earth like some of these other ones because it is still a sophisticated dessert you can find at some aristocratic restaurants and gourmet European dining joints. However, it's really got a long career at this point. I mean, this recipe has been a local resident of everyone's kitchens here since what? The 17th century? Forget my grandparents. I think my bloodline may have started back then. And it's amazing how it has managed to go through so many years while not really ever changing much from its original flavor. Even the version we have today is a refinement, but it hasn't lost the flavor of the original recipes. Southern skillet cornbread has been a beloved memento of the South for many decades to the rest of the nation, but in the area, it is a tradition that goes back all the way to the 18th century. History books tell us that it comes from Native American cuisine, and it makes sense since a lot of Native American cuisine was very cost-effective. It is kind of everything you would want in a home-cooked meal, easy on the wallet, simple ingredients you can find at any nearby store, and little prep time. which means you can get your cravings fulfilled immediately. Plus, most cooks back then were so accustomed to it from a lifetime of making cornbread in these cast iron skillets that they could make it much faster than even an experienced cook. Guess experience counts for something, especially when you have 40 to 50 years of it, right? Since we're on the topic of pies, cherry pie was another one of Grandma's culinary masterpieces. This was the kind of dessert that made any bad day 10 times better with just one bite. Traditionally, cherry pie was made with sour cherries rather than sweet cherries. Morello cherries were one of the most common kinds of cherry used, but other varieties such as the black cherry were also popular. So, cherry pie is considered one of the most iconic pies in America, second to only apple pie. There's a famous story about young George Washington chopping down a cherry tree and then confessing to it saying, "I cannot tell a lie." Legend says this cemented the importance of cherry in American history and inspired our grandmas to add the fruit to their delicious desserts and meals. Cherry salad was another popular dessert back in the day. Buttermilk coconut pies were usually 9-inch pie crusts filled with this rich, thick buttermilk custard that had these tropical notes of coconut accompanying it. Most people in the 1900s had this locked down and would regularly make it, passing the recipe on to their kids so that they could make it for their children one day. You cannot teach your grandmother to suck eggs, though, and neither can you teach her how to make a better coconut pie. Whether it was the amount of buttermilk, the flaky but crumbly crust, or the custard filling that lured you into an incredibly peaceful food coma, is beyond us. Buttermilk coconut pies had it all, though, and no one knew what the secret was. Was it how they beat the eggs to perfection, or the small window of a few seconds between perfectly golden brown and overdone? Either way, making one of these was like a Tuesday afternoon reflex to many grannies. As a country, we can thank Texas for a lot of things. Tex-Mex cuisine, an infinite supply of memes thanks to country music, rodeos, some of the nicest BBQ sauces you'll ever have, and a guaranteed chuckle every time you have to speak to a redneck Republican. If you want to keep adding to the list, a good chili con carne is something that'll make you even more thankful the state exists and has developed into the savory jackpot it is. The dish pretty much means chili with meat, and it's a wonderful blend of beef, chilies, and spices with roots in the Mexican borderlands. It's somewhat become a symbol of Texas cooking too, which is known for not being easy on your stomach at all. This dish is no different because it takes cubed beef, chili peppers, and beans, plus some canned tomatoes, and puts them in a slow cooker. The one-pot way of cooking it was kind of considered a massive game changer because, while yes, you could just leave it to cook now, it meant that you didn't have to stir the chili constantly. The thing with chili con carne is that unless you did that stirring, you really wouldn't get the same bang for your buck. Inexpensive, popular in chili parlors, and very good with a cold beer, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out how this dish has all the elements it needs to succeed in middle-class Texas. A lot of the recipes from the times of our parents come from the Depression and from when America was recovering from it, but things like baked ziti is what they would whip up when they had a bit of money in their pocket. Some cooked ziti, ricotta cheese, eggs, and spaghetti sauce meant for an incredibly easy and amazing pasta. If you had the Parmesan to spare, you could also sprinkle it on or add a melted layer as a topping. It did not take too long to make, and it tasted very different from regular pasta or spaghetti and meatballs, which was a recipe favored by moms more than grandmas. The real highlight of the dish is in the shape of the ziti, since they end up being these 25 to 30 centimeter tubes. When they turn into soft pasta, they become great for chewing and work really well with the cheese. Grandmas would always spice it up with some beef or duck here and there, though. You can't possibly have a conversation about forgotten grandma desserts and not bring up the infamous blackberry cobbler. This one was a summer favorite when blackberries were in season and at their peak of flavor. So, cobblers have their roots in early American history. Pioneers who traveled across the country had to make do with what they had, and traditional pies were difficult to bake on the road. Instead, they would cover the fruit with a layer of biscuit dough or batter and cook it in a Dutch oven, creating what we now know as a cobbler. The blackberries didn't only give the cobbler some flavor, but also packed it with antioxidants. This dessert was particularly famous in southern states and was a staple at many southern family gatherings, church picnics, and barbecues. Speaking of the chefs of today, they have some pretty interesting differences when it comes to the modern take on a mincemeat pie. These days you see dried fruits and even rum and brandy being used in the dish along with various spices. No sign of meat anywhere, despite it literally being in the name. In the past, mutton or ground beef and raisins, nuts, pecans, seasonal dry fruits like these were all you needed to make an exceptionally lovely mincemeat pie. This pie has always been typically served at Christmas, but it took off so well in the South that many families would just have it as a weekly dinner too. Do you have any memories of a mincemeat pie from your childhood days? What kind of differences can you note between the pies of then and now? We sure see a lot of differences. On the other end of the spectrum, we have something brazenly American, with something with a lot of influences from spicy recipes popular in Mexican cooking. I was expecting something that would set you on fire like you were, but tamale pies are actually pretty neat in that regard. They're kind of like a build-your-own burger because you can adjust a lot of things about this to create your own tamale pie specific to your tastes. Basically, there's no universal standard, no golden rule of thumb you need to follow here. That's probably why it became such a well-loved middle-class dish, because it meant that people could easily tweak the recipe however they needed according to whatever was there in the pantry. Hey, sometimes it's the last of the month and you just don't have a lot of oomph going on in your pantry. Sometimes you get a slight bonus and you decide to get that better, premium cut of meat. Both times can be a tamale pie night if you're down. You couldn't say that before the slow cooker because it meant that you'd have to spend a lot of your day babysitting the dish, but now, the dish just makes itself really. If you want a tame introduction to Mexican food, tamale pies might be a good place to start, or if you just like tomato sauce-based pies with chili seasonings and cornmeal. If you were going on over to your grandparents for a casual Christmas or Thanksgiving visit, you may have been surprised to find that the dinner table was anything but casual, with delicacies like squash casserole. Creamy, crunchy, and filled with cheddar cheese and crackers, it is an all-time favorite that has been a staple of holidays and birthdays in many households. It was more popular to correctly reflect past tense in the 20th century, which explains why you would usually only find your grandparents making it, and back then, it would be very common to have this at potlucks. Some households still have it at theirs, but the trend has taken a bit of nosedive with the cracker and cheese combo taking a bit of a backseat. That only goes for if you are ordering a squash casserole from a restaurant though, because from the hands of any American granny, it was a dish impossible to resist. You and I both know this list would be incomplete without the mention of classic whoopie pies. Now, these come with an interesting origin story. Whoopie pies are believed to have originated in the northeastern United States, particularly in Pennsylvania Dutch country, or Maine. According to legend, when Amish women would bake these treats, their husbands or children would exclaim, "Whoopie!" upon finding them in their lunch pails. And let's be honest, we all did that little whoopie when we sighted this one in our grandma's fridge. So these were a perfect cross between a cake and a cookie. But despite their name, they were more like mini cakes than actual pies. These were the best on-the-go treats that you could just grab on your way out. Also, here's a fun fact. In 2011, the whoopie pie was named the official state treat of Vegetable pie recipes go all the way back to Europe, but this is about America, so let's stick to the Cliff Notes version of our history tour. Sweet potato pie actually got very popular in the southern parts of the USA during the colonial era, when America was still a colony under the British Empire. Sweet potatoes had always been used by Southern folk in their desserts. Initially, the vegetable was popularized by Black American households that spread their magic across the nation. It gets more interesting, though, as word is they got the idea from Native American cooking practices. Basically, the rabbit hole of who made it first can go deep, but none of that matters when you consider how cost-effective and delicious this pie is. Potatoes in general were becoming the top most consumed vegetable, and to find a way to incorporate it into a dessert for the masses is cooking talent at its finest. As far as the chili craze goes, when America did go through phases of wanting spicier food, a lot of states besides Texas would go back to this southern classic. Some say this dish is also a Native American classic because if you go to the Southwest, you'll find remnants of old tribes, like the Pueblo, who still make variants of this dish. Theirs are even more traditional, with the recipes largely unchanged since pre-colonial European times. Chili con carne is a wonderful melting pot of indigenous, Mexican, and Spanish that takes full advantage of the different backgrounds that are present in American cooking. Let's go on over to Creole cuisine. Want to know a hot spot for that kind of cooking back in the 1970s? It was shrimp Creole, which had hints of several other styles of cooking. You could have something with French, Spanish, and African influences all in one bite. That's a pretty vast variety of flavors, so let's break down what shrimp Creole had out of all of that. You have your basics like bell peppers, onions, and celery, but it also had canned tomatoes for a no-fuss sauce that really soaked in all of the aromatics and gave the shrimp a pretty unique flair. You could make this dish for around $2.80 back then, because per lb of shrimp usually cost you around $1.50 or $2 back then. That's a pretty bare minimum price, but let's say you were cooking for a family of 4. You would have been good in like $10 or $15 maximum. The whole mix of onions, celery, and peppers was actually considered a trinity in Cajun and Creole cooking. Shrimp Creole also made a lot of use of thyme, parsley, okra, and garlic as well, so you could really mix and match and see what worked best for you. Not everyone liked the traditional versions of the dish, and I can't blame them because it's meant for people who grew up having a completely different palate than ours. All the same, this dish, which is traditionally served over rice, was considered one of the greatest hits of the cuisine. Cajun and Creole in general had found a pretty nice home for themselves in places like New Orleans and Louisiana. Restaurants like Antoine's and Tujag's in the 19th century were establishing a solid Creole cooking scene, and by the 20th century, cookbooks had already featured shrimp Creole as a solid dish you could rely on whenever you needed more seafood in your diet. There are some baking challenges that only your grandmother is equipped for, and making the pinnacle of brown butter sweet potato pies was one of them. Seriously, even bakeries and fancy eateries have struggled to nail every aspect of a pie, but for most home chefs in the United States, it seems to be just another Tuesday with the oven. You take a flaky pie crust with a velvety potato filling that is usually topped off with whipped cream, but most older cooks preferred maple syrup as that was what they grew up with. Just a bit of dark brown sugar would elevate this dish into the perfect dessert, though it would often steal the show entirely on its own. The thing is built to make your mouth water, and we mean looks-wise too, since the brown and caramel hues of the pie just make it all the more enticing. Have you ever heard of this one before, and would you try it? Okay, so this next dessert's reputation speaks for itself. I'm talking about snickerdoodle cookies. This bad boy was timeless. You could be 5 or you could be 45 and still enjoy the soft, chewy snickerdoodles coated in cinnamon sugar, which gave them a sweet, slightly spicy flavor. And trust me, it was impossible to resist. Snickerdoodles are considered a classic American cookie, with a history that dates back to the late 1800s. 2 centuries later, they're still a fan favorite. Now, you could get these at many popular bakeries, but nothing beats what Granny whipped up in minutes back in the day. This biscuit was the star of Grandma's cookie jar, and always the first one to disappear. Let's take it up a notch with some fancy pies instead of basic ones, and the cranberry chiffon pie does not disappoint by any means. Like a dish torn right out of a baking simulation game, with cranberry juice, oranges, egg whites, and more, this pie looks just a little better than it tastes. If the taste is a 10 out of 10, then we are dealing with a 10.5 in terms of appearance. Some things just go past your expectations, do they not? This was a pie you could find both in bakeries and in the homes of your family as you would visit, but there was nothing like a fresh chiffon pie right out of Grandma's oven. Navy bean soup, as the name implies, is one right out of the cookbooks of the military. See, all those soldiers get so awfully tired from traveling to other countries all of the time, they end up needing soups filled with ham and cured pork to put some pep in their step. Navy bean soup was particularly nice for 2 reasons. It was already cheap, which was kind of the theme of the time with the World Wars. But even after that, the habit of rationing and using cheap ingredients for military ventures didn't really go away. Anything that cuts costs, right? Navy bean soup definitely knew how to save money. And once slow cookers became a thing, it was saving time too. The second reason is that it was pretty easy to make wherever you were, and it was easy to carry around too, in pots or a thermos. This meant that it was the perfect military food. Healthy, easy to make in bulk, and easy to carry around. Don't think it takes a genius to figure out why they abused this recipe to the moon and back. Now, mashed potatoes and gravy need no introduction or explanation. Everyone and their mother's mother has had it. But did you know how good they were at making it? Receiving this dish from the chefs of generations ago was an entirely different experience in comfort. We do not know what spices they would mix, as each area had its own variations, with some even using mushrooms. Most popular was coriander, thyme, black pepper, and some oregano. The gravy would even put KFC to shame, if we are being completely honest. You just did not feel like eating from the outside when you had such fine dining available at home, and it was the perfect thing to get you back up only our feet from an exhausting day. I think it's fair to say that apples were a crucial part of whipping up desserts back in the day. But hey, apple pie wasn't the only sweet treat we got out of this fruit. Remember Grandma's apple dumplings? These were made by wrapping a whole or sliced apple in dough and then baking it until golden brown. And Grandma's apple syrup topping was like cherry on top. This was a labor-intensive dessert, which is pretty much why it's associated with Grandma's kitchen. The process of peeling, coring, and stuffing the apples and then carefully wrapping them in dough was a true labor of love. This one was commonly enjoyed as a dessert, but no one judged you if you ate it as breakfast. I mean, pair it with a cup of coffee and your taste buds will thank you. Since we are on the topic of tropical pies, let's take a look at chocolate haupia pies, which were a pretty regular staple of Hawaiian cuisine. These also had their fair share of coconut-based goodness, as they would be covered with a coconut haupia layer that would be made using thickened coconut milk. Then you would just layer the chocolate into a pie crust and top it off with however much whipped cream you fancied. Next to hula pie, this is probably one of the most famous pies to ever come from the island of Hawaii, and even McDonald's had their own brief take on it, though it came nowhere close to the bangers you would experience from the locals. If you are one of the people who enjoys a good coconut-based dessert, then maybe try this one out someday. There is probably a good reason why it got so popular across America. I'll forgive you for thinking this is another showcase of how we tried to copy other countries' culinary mojo, because Swiss steak does sound pretty well Swiss. What might raise your eyebrow is that this is actually a purely American dish. It involved braising, which is a kind of slow cooking that tenderizes any cut of meat to the maximum, and this one involved a round steak in a tomato-based sauce with bell peppers. It was a pretty big classic in the 30s and 40s. Whenever people could afford to get some cuts of meat, they were usually cheap, and as a result, they were more than likely to be tough ones. A dish like this that could take even rubber disguised as beef and turn it into a buttery, smooth steak was a godsend in those times. The fact that it didn't need a lot of work on the side to make it shine also meant that it was something the populace could really jibe with, and slow cooker meant that you could braise away without worry. It wasn't one of the most popular steaks ever, and of course, if you were working with recipes that were centered around making better cuts of meat shine, you'd probably get a more decent steak experience, but it was a homely meal to have after a tough shift or a day spent taking care of the kids. Can anyone ask for more relief? Especially when cooking, it became a non-issue later on. Beef stew is a nostalgic childhood dish nobody can go without. Fresh pearl onions and a broth made out of the beef stock were the tricks to an unbeatable stew that is sorely missed every time you eat one that is not your grandma's. The modern-day beef stew involves an entire list of 10 ingredients for better readability that feels more like an overdone broth mixed with a lot of toppings. But that is because beef stews have gone a bit out of fashion unless you are in the South. This is also because beef stews today are usually made with red wine as a base. But the hearty and vigor-filled ones of your childhood were all about keeping it simple with vegetables and a solid cut of beef. Well, rice pudding is also one that wasn't just delicious, but also healthy. Don't you love it when sweet treats come with health benefits? Talk about a good deal. So, I'm sure I don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of this one because who doesn't remember the taste of rice pudding? It started out as a way to use up leftover rice and soon became the dessert that had everyone coming back for seconds. Not only this, but rice pudding was one of the easiest desserts to make and was made with ingredients easily found around the house like rice, milk, and sugar. Rice pudding originated in Europe and was brought to the States by European immigrants. Our grandmas decide to take the classic dessert up a notch by adding some key ingredients like vanilla, nutmeg, maple syrup, or cinnamon. Now, with the change in tastes and trends, this one never made it to big restaurants, but let's be honest, Grandma made it better than any Michelin star chef could possibly have. It's something about making sweet treats with a whole lot less sugar and a whole lot more love. The goodness of a peanut butter cream pie does not have to end at just the ones you get from Little Debbie's, at least not for a lot of families that grew up with the confection. It was a very balanced harmony of flavors that were a bit unfamiliar when you thought about the fact that they are in a pie, but it made them work just as well as any other classic. Peanut butter and cream cheese will surprisingly go very well together. There are even no bake versions, which make it a lot easier to whip this up or even get a batch going. Actually, most pies in this list have no bake versions, and one thing you will notice even with this one is that a lot of them are incredibly easy to make. Not at all as complicated as the show-stopping desserts of today, perhaps keeping it simple is where the real magic lies. After all, nothing ever went wrong with an extra helping of peanut butter. Ropa vieja is a nostalgic dish, though it doesn't have the same long-standing popularity in America. If you go to Spanish communities here, you'll definitely find a similar sentiment in people's hearts, but you'll also find some of the most eye-popping plates of food you'll ever see. Don't even get me started on the tastes, because this takes the basics of Cajun cooking and makes it as explosive as we know Spanish cooking to be in terms of flavor. Cuban immigrants are again who we can thank for introducing this to us in the first place, since they were the ones that made Spanish cuisine pop off in Florida and its cooking scene. It's a comfort food of the decade, definitely, and the most popular one for ropa vieja was arguably the 1970s. That's because it was never again as accessible as it was back then when people got the slow cooker. They were excited to try out all these dishes that previously they just didn't have access to. It's kind of like when you get a new car and you just can't wait to take it for a test run. Cuban-American households were already using this dish heavily, but ropa vieja meant that now the broader Caucasian audience could finally bask in a masterclass of flavors, spices, and seasonings too, after so long. Speaking of how different things were in their time due to the economical strife, one thing that got really popular back when your grandparents were still young was sausage gravy and biscuits. This might seem like an outlandish combo to us today, and we admit it takes a bit of getting used to, but the magic is all in the gravy. Biscuits and gravy are already something Americans have been pretty accustomed to eating, especially in the 20th century, but innovation is one of the finer points of the country, and culinary matters are no exception. People eventually found out that using pork sausage crumbles enriched the gravy and made it irresistible, especially if they were smoked. Usually biscuits like jumbo buttermilk ones make for a great side to the dish, but even the gravy alone was worth eating on its own. Okay, so this next one was a staple on Grandma's dinner table during the holidays. Yeah, I'm talking about the spice cake. Come on. There's no way you don't remember this bad boy. Spice cake had been a beloved dessert for centuries, with origins tracing back to medieval Europe. The use of spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves in cakes became popular during the 18th and 19th centuries after these ingredients were brought to America. Someone's grandma decided to add spices to an old-fashioned cake batter, and let's just say we're extremely grateful for it. This cake shaped many childhoods as its aroma marked the start of fall and holiday season. From Thanksgiving days to Christmas mornings, this one was always sitting in the kitchen for anyone who wanted a taste of the season. We all love a good chiffon pie cake, and grandmas are known to get pretty busy with them, especially if it is for a special occasion. We are not sure if Halloween comes into that for you, but for many kids in the late 1900s to 2000s, you could not celebrate October's finest activity without pumpkin chiffon pie. made with a custard filling that used pumpkin and mixed with egg whites beaten to sheer, creamy perfection, gave the pie a fluffy meringue-like texture that really did justice to the chiffon genre of desserts. Plus, the granulated sugar brought out the best within the pumpkin. Grandmas all around had perfected the art of making sure the gelatin mixed as well as it could with the egg whites, and that is what made their pies so incredibly airy and weightless. Pork and sauerkraut are things that come right out of German-American communities. Put this in a pot and leave it to cook, and let the fragrance carry you right to the streets of Munich and Prague, where New Year's celebrations meant that everyone had an incredible amount of pork and sauerkraut available all the time. It's definitely a historical middle-class dish associated with the late 1900s, and the slow cooking meant that even really tough cuts of pork could become tender, soft, melt-in-your-mouth slices of pork that got anyone's appetite going. When people were exploring foods from other countries, Pennsylvania in particular took a big interest in German food. Maybe because it had its fair share of German-American communities, or maybe because it was just that good. But either way, if you wanted to take an express tour into what German eating felt like, you would go on over to the Midwest or Pennsylvania to try this. Pot roasts have been as much a part of the grand scheme of American culture and cuisine as anything else on this dish, and each area, state, and neighborhood has their own ideas of what one should look like. Were you the kind of kid that grew up on beef chuck roast, potatoes, a beefy broth, and carrots in your roast? Maybe you had boneless chuck roast, olive oil, bay leaves, and stuff like that instead. These are just the few variations you can expect to find when it comes to a good, well-done pot roast. The perfect party snack or a great one to pull out for an incredibly large family dinner with the in-laws and extended family, this is one dish that never fails to pull through, especially when a seasoned cook is behind it. Next up, we gave the rhubarb pie. This is another one of Grandma's treats that wasn't too sweet or heavy on the stomach. It was a springtime hit made with fresh rhubarb sugar and often a touch of cinnamon or nutmeg. Rhubarb grows abundantly in gardens, and this recipe was the perfect way to use it up and celebrate the flavors of the season. Remember when we'd wait all year long for spring to come just for a slice of this one? Well, some grandmas canned or froze the rhubarb to use throughout the year. Rhubarb is naturally quite tart and can be too sour to eat raw. In pies, it was typically paired with sugar to create a more palatable and balanced flavor. Grandmas often experimented with different amounts of sugar and other ingredients like strawberries to complement the tartness of rhubarb. One blessed thing about the hand of a passionate grandparent cooking for their favorite family members is that they always knew how to get the best out of the bland and boring. Things like apples were suddenly key players in cultural delicacies like apple cider vinegar pie, when before, parents would struggle to get their kids to even maintain eye contact with an apple for more than 10 seconds. Granted, these were sautéed apples with vinegar, vanilla, cinnamon, and a lot of time in the oven, but they were still irresistible. A good cinnamon or maple syrup was the perfect sauce to round this pie off and bring its full potential as an acidic but sweet slice of heaven out. Apple cider vinegar has been a popular hit in America for many decades now, and it does not look like the grandparents of today intend to change that. Mulligan stew is a dish that's often associated with lower-class cooking, and it was even something that homeless people relied on to get by the week. It can be best described as a makeshift meal, though if I were being fully real with you, it was just the best you could make out of whatever scraps you had. What I couldn't tell you is how nice this actually ended up being, and the invention of the slow cooker meant that it took a lot less time to make. You could make it with potatoes, vegetables, or even dumplings, and it has evolved from a meal that you'd usually associate with horrible times and poverty to a staple of home-cooked one-pot meals. Working and middle-class families often resort to this when they want to take care of everyone's appetite in one go, and man, it really works. Speaking of cheddar cheese and nostalgic family meals, we cannot go without mentioning the ever-timeless King Ranch chicken casserole. This is definitely a dish for those people who feel like casseroles without meat or protein of any kind are missing something and do not feel as fulfilling. It would take about an hour to cook, but this did massive numbers in every neighborhood from Detroit to Texas. Especially more so in the South, it was a common practice for families to preserve their King Ranch chicken casserole recipes. The real strength of the dish was that you could use as much of the ingredients as you wanted, letting you double or even triple the dish, an advantage that Southern grandmas would very often use when they were in the mood to dote on their grandkids. Maine. So, blondies are the butterscotch-flavored cousins of brownies and are also often called blonde brownies. Surprisingly, blondies actually predate brownies. Recipes for molasses-flavored bar cookies, which are considered early versions of blondies, appeared in cookbooks as far back as the late 19th century, before the more famous chocolate brownie took the spotlight. Grandmas often baked these when they wanted a break from chocolate treats. While brownies may have overshadowed blondies for a while, blondies have been making a comeback in recent years. They've become a trendy dessert at cafes and bakeries, where they're often topped off with gourmet ingredients like toffee bits, browned butter, or even. That wraps up old recipes our grandparents left us with. Comment which recipe reminds you most of your grandparents, and don't forget to like and subscribe.